let's call this meeting of the Waunakee School Board to order. All directors are present. And we already had our closed session at 6:30. And we just need approval of the minutes. Unless there's any changes or omissions.
I move we approve all 4 sets of minutes. Good from my perspective.
Mark, any second?
Second.
Second, Joan. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? And the minutes are approved. Approval of the agenda as listed.
So moved. Second.
Joan and Judy. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? And that takes us to public comments. We do have a few today.
There was a person in person.
Oh, there's one here in person?
You just check, Steve, if there was an in-person individual.
I think.
Yes.
You got a slip, don't you?
Yep.
It's probably in the basket.
I hope you can see my smile. My eyes.
Please just ask that you state your name
Sure.
and your relationship to the district.
Okay. I am going to read my thoughts tonight in order to abide by the 3-minute rule limit. My name is Katie Dotzler. My husband and I have lived in Waunakee for 11 years and are very thankful for the opportunity to raise our 3 children in this community. All 3 of our children are very fortunate to have the opportunity to attend Waunakee schools. I've always been very involved in the schools as a classroom volunteer, PTO president, teacher appreciation committee chair, coach, substitute teacher, booster club president, rally around Waunakee campaign member, and was very active in supporting our district's last referendum as a leader in the Yes for Schools campaign. We love Waunakee and our schools. I'm here today as one of 450 community members who signed the Waunakee Concerned Parents petition in July advocating for in-person instruction for our students. I will be reading a letter sent on behalf of Waunakee Concerned Parents. Please note that if we weren't in this situation where one person is allowed to speak and open comment due to the pandemic, hundreds of parents and community members would be standing behind me in support of this letter. Here's the letter. We recognize, based on multiple Waunakee Community School District surveys and community petitions, that the majority of Waunakee families want their kids to have the opportunity for K-12 in-person instruction. With last week's suspension of the latest order put forth by PHMBC, we expect that every effort will be made by the Waunakee Community School District Administration and the Board of Education to ensure that this occurs for all Waunakee students while continuing to provide the option for virtual learning for those who choose this learning mode. We expect that these efforts will also include core curriculars. We are fortunate to live in a very active, involved, and capable community. Please continue to be resourceful by involving community members in your planning. Parents, booster club members, paraeducators, teachers, other community members, etc. Together we can make this happen, and moving forward this should be our main focus. Many other schools in Wisconsin are currently executing an in-person learning model for all grades with much success. Arrowhead, Conomowoc, Lake Mills, Sauk Prairie, Elmbrook, Cedarburg, Whitefish Bay, Kimberly, to name a few. Let's work with these school districts to develop best practices and to avoid reinventing the wheel. In the meantime, we have the opportunity to take advantage of utilizing our facilities, our gyms, our fields, our practice fields. Attached is a document recently posted on social media by the WIA outlining the numerous benefits of student participation in co-curricular activities. We are thankful for the Waunakee coaches and leaders that have worked tirelessly to put together detailed and safe plans that have allowed our kids to participate in activities. Strength and conditioning, summer band camp, cross-country training, tennis, golf practice, boys soccer, etc. Please allow our students to take advantage of the opportunity to participate in activities. School is more than just academics. Kids need to be involved in co-curricular activities like band, FFA, DECA, intramurals, athletics, for their mental and physical well-being. While the scope may be large, it is not impossible. We can work together to make this happen for all of our students. Now is the time to prepare, plan, and work together to get our kids back in school. We are resourceful. We are resilient. We don't make excuses. We are leaders, and we are thankful for our committed educational leadership team. Go Warriors. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have 6 comments that were also emailed in. From Tiffany Bernard Schultz. Board of Education, I'm writing today to encourage you to bring at least some of the younger grades back to the buildings as soon as you're able. My child is a third grader, and although I've seen how hard the teachers have worked to make virtual learning work, it should be a permanent solution for in-person learning. As I drove past Arboretum Elementary this morning and saw some kindergartners outside running and playing, I yearned for my third grader to have the same opportunity with his classmates. Currently, these kids are only seeing each other through a screen. They need the diversity of their classmates as they continue to receive a well-rounded education. Since March, these kids have been disconnected from most of their classmates. Waunakee has always been the leader in education. I've observed the K-2 processes myself, from getting on the bus to health slip collection at the door, and it seems to be going well. Let's be the leader to bring more of our students back, paving the way for other districts to do the same and say, we wish we would have done that. Respectfully, Tiffany Schultz. Parent input for tonight's school board meeting from Rebecca Williams. Dear Waunakee School Board, our high school senior is motivated to actively participating in courses but is struggling with virtual learning even in cases with highly skilled teachers. She reports a greater burden in teaching herself the material relative to past years. The online portals are an acceptable temporary solution but are not sustainable for a full academic year, where engagement will decline with consequences to learning and social-emotional well-being. To bridge these shortfalls, and at a bare minimum, I must advocate the schools provide opportunities for in-person activities that partner with the online course content, such as hands-on experience in lab experiments, innovation center, as well as outdoor gatherings of small groups for discussion, review, etc., and additional co-curricular opportunities, such as outside drama exercises, band, etc. Additionally, I strongly encourage the board to ask the middle school and high school to plan for a return to in-person instruction. At last week's board meeting, Superintendent Gutenberg acknowledged that the planning to date facilitated the virtual environment, but that substantial hurdles remain for hybrid instruction. This situation does not reflect the school district commitment to foster in-person learning, as clearly desired by many households in the community. Following CDC guidelines, transmission within classrooms has very rarely reported, as reinforced last week in a statement by UW-Madison Chancellor Blank, who noted that there was been no evidence of transmission in the classroom or in the workplace. Without the foundational logistics organized, I fear planning the current virtual schooling will be maintained by default. Thank you, Becky Williams, 1264 Hanover Trail, Waunakee. Next is from Lisa Rada, to be read at the Board of Education. As a concerned parent in our community, I'm all about choices for our families. I, however, am very aware through research that is going on right here at UW-Madison that is not in our best interest for the health of our community to send our children back to school. I also have a cousin who is a physician for Dean in Madison who cares for the patients put on tubes. This virus is not to be messed with. Yes, most people will recover, but the long-lasting effects of the virus are why we don't want to expose ourselves more than is necessary. Lungs and brains are having long-lasting effects of the virus. Please see attached research documents. I originally did sign the petition to get our kids back in school, with it being a choice for families. Now, as it has been over a month since that petition, I have changed my mind because of how things have progressed in Wisconsin. When UW-La Crosse and UW-Madison have dorms full of students quarantined or going back home, which exposes all other family members to COVID, and then that family has a student that would attend one of our schools exposing other students. As an analogy, if we cross a street, we know that we pretty much will get to the other side safely. However, if you cross the Beltline during rush hour traffic, our odds went down to cross safely. So why are we wanting to send our kids back during rush hour? Let's be patient for a bit longer and cross safely to get to the other side. I too want my child to be back in school for her mental health, but I am not wanting to sacrifice her long-term health for a little bit longer, safer environment. We have gone 6 months already, so a couple more months is not the end of the world. In the big picture of life, this is just a small piece of time. Questions I have: how many teachers would teach if in-person instruction begins? I'm sure some will not want that exposure. 2, survey parents again to see how many will have kids attend in person or choose to stay virtual. 3, how will kids keep the 6-foot distance in school? 4, this is fall allergy season and kids are sneezing, headaches, etc. How are those symptoms going to be differentiated with possible COVID symptoms? 5, if teachers are doing virtual and in-person instruction, are we going to stick with 45-minute classes or go back to 1.5-hour classes? 6, can we please be a bit more patient before sending our kids back to school in person? Thank you for your time. There is no right or wrong answer here. There is only being patient and keeping the health and safety of our kids and family and community first and foremost. Lisa Rada. Next is from Jason Grosh. Greetings. We are fairly certain you have received emails similar to the below and attached from concerned parents of the WCSD. We largely agree with the sentiment expressed by the Waunakee concerned parents. We believe you will find many members of the community enthusiastic and very willing to send their kids to school in this environment to reap the numerous and important developmental benefits provided by in-person schooling. We also believe you will find the community is very supportive of providing the teachers with sufficient resources to enable them to feel safe, providing their essential in-person services in this environment. We have 4 children, a 6-year-old enrolled in first grade at Prairie, twin 4-year-olds and an infant. We moved to Waunakee because of the cutting-edge reputation of the public schools in Waunakee. To the extent private schools are able to provide these essential services that we find that WCSD is not willing to, enrolling our children in private schools for the duration of their elementary school education becomes more and more likely. Thank you for all the time you have devoted to these issues, Jason and Jen Grosh. Next is from Amy Freidig. Dear BOE members, I'm planning to advocate for 3rd and 4th grade. I'm ready to advocate for 3rd and 4th grade to return to the hybrid in-person model planned prior to the Dane County order. Given the only reason that children were prevented from returning has now been thrown out, I expect the board to initiate preparations for the in-person return immediately, as was indicated would happen in prior meetings. Do not paint the Waunakee and West Point areas with the same brush as the UW campus. Do not prevent young children from the schooling they need, which is absolutely not virtual, due to either lack of will or fear. There is no acceptable reason, given the cohorts and safety measures in place, that the rest of elementary can't return as K through 2 as you promised they would. I have a first grader who has returned from school every day last week in a better frame of mind than any day last spring. The district is providing a free and appropriate public education to K through 2s. Now it is time to provide it for the 3rd and 4th graders. Thank you, Amy Friede. Next is from Joanne Flock. I am requesting that all school-age children be given the option for in-person education and co-curricular activities. Most importantly, experts have recommended that this is for a child's well-being. Other school systems similar to Waunakee are making it work. Waunakee has been noted as one of the top school systems in the state. People move here because of our school system. If we don't provide in-person education, our children will be less prepared and will fall behind children from the school districts that do provide in-person education and co-curricular activities. I have very little confidence in the quality and consistency of the virtual education being provided. I am a grandparent and in a vulnerable group to COVID because of my age and because of underlying medical conditions. I will take necessary steps as I deem necessary to protect myself from this virus. Others who are vulnerable can do the same. Parents will still have the option for virtual education for their children. However, don't enforce that for those families who want in-person education for their children, and certainly don't enforce it with the excuse of protecting people like me. We can isolate ourselves if we choose. Thank you for this consideration. You can read this at the board meeting. Joanne Flock. And that's the end of public comments, if there's no one else. And that'll take us on to 9 teaching staff, student, and board reports. First is the WTA statement to the board, which they have provided. Members of the Board of Education of the Waunakee Community School District. The WTA is pleased to report that the first week of 2020-21 school year with students went relatively smoothly. Many educators experienced good attendance from students, few technological hiccups, and a general adherence by students to the new safety and social distancing protocols the district has put in place. We acknowledge the accessibility of and communication by our building level leadership, in addition to that of our student services and administrative staff, as we continue to navigate these unusual times. We appreciate the built-in time to create a sense of community and focus on SEL. The WTA is aware of the recent decision by the Wisconsin State Supreme Court to temporarily suspend the Dane County Public Health Order requiring virtual instruction for children in grades 3 through 12. Given the startling and steady rise of positive cases of COVID-19 in Dane County, we urge the Waunakee Board of Education to continue with virtual instruction for students in these grades until official resolution has been reached. With the possibility of a district-wide closure ever looming as the pandemic continues to spread, We want to ensure that our students and families can be supported, accommodated, and remain safely connected. With a final court decision still pending, we advocate for patience in making major changes to our learning models, as ever-shifting plans have an adverse effect on our students and families. In the weeks preceding the 2020-21 school year, Waunakee educators and staff experienced what could only be described as whiplash. We continue to receive constantly changing and conflicting recommendations regarding how to most appropriately interact with and serve our students within school buildings, community placements, and online. For example, pushing superfluous standardized assessments when instructional time already is limited and precious seems to conflict with the Board of Education's prioritization of equity in SEL. The constraints of the current teaching year have put an unprecedented demand on all stakeholders in our educational community, including families. The dust is just beginning to settle, with many teachers and students adjusting to new programs and adapting to various virtual and hybrid models. To allow the Supreme Court ruling to disrupt what slowly is becoming a more firmly outlined and manageable school routine would be a significant disservice to educators, students, and the Waunakee community as a whole. Please continue maintaining our district's current plans for grades pre-K2 and 3-12 until challenges to the public health ruling have been thoroughly vetted and voted upon. Postponing a decision would allow our educators to continue to strengthen and expand the learning foundations they already have laid, as well as providing much needed consistency for our students and families during a time filled with uncertainty. In partnership, WTA leadership. That takes us on to board reports. If any board members have something that they have done within the last month that affected the school. It's pretty hard to do most of these things now. I will say that I have used Chef Brian's family meal plan, and it works really well. I was surprised you barely drive in, they throw it in the back of your car, and you're gone. And the food was excellent. The great thing is, when I was there tonight picking up our meal, Cindy shared with me that it looks like they're getting 75 to 100 family meals per day, and as such, they're expecting to hire 2 more staff back and get them off unemployment, which would be great. And it seems like it's helping. She said she'll probably present a new budget shortly, reflecting that if it maintains itself. But as of this week, they're still going to be at those numbers. Connie? I got the name wrong. Okay. If there's nothing else, then we'll move on to item 10, COVID-19 updates.
We have 3 items on the agenda tonight. I'm going to ask Kirk to step up to the table here, if you would, Kirk, while I kind of do a review of these. First thing is I want to just review what's occurred with the Supreme Court ruling and kind of what some of the impacts are on us so that we can discuss some of our next steps. We'll also talk about the face mask policy, part of the state order coming to a close at the end of the month and what the future of that may hold and how we've articulated that in policy. And then Brian will join us to talk about substitute teachers. But the first thing we have in front of us is really to talk about the Supreme Court ruling. Brian contacted me over the weekend and just brought forth a good suggestion to see if our school district attorney, Kirk Strang, could be with us this evening, and I appreciate, Kirk, you fitting that into your schedule on very short notice. What I've asked Kirk to do is just walk through kind of the Supreme Court ruling, what that means with regards to what that process looks like, what that decision kind of means for districts in our county, and then really open it up to any questions that members of the board may have, and have that as part of the beginning of our discussion as far as where we are with our planning process. But certainly the last week was a decision point that impacts some of the things that we're doing. So Kirk, if I can, one, just reintroduce you, and then second of all, have you kind of walk through what's occurred at the Supreme Court with regards to the public health order.
Great, thank you, Randy. I guess I'll start by saying my name is Kirk Strang. I'm the district's general counsel. I don't often meet with the board in that capacity, but I've been general counsel to the district for almost 20 years. And so we've worked with the district's administration more commonly than with the board, but for something like this, it's clearly a board issue, and And of course, Brian and Randy talked about having us provide this update to you. I should say I still meet an exception under the governor's order because I'm allowed to remove my mask to deliver an educational address of some sort. Also, my glasses will fog up if I don't. So with your permission, I'm going to take the mask off. I think I'm more than 6 feet away from everybody. So with that, let me get started with just a brief summary of the court's decision. This decision represents a consolidation of a few cases, all of which involve petitioners who are opposed to Dane County's order affecting in-person instruction and essentially requiring that virtual instruction take place at most grade levels. The court, of course, has a case to decide on the merits, but the petitioners asked that the court issue a temporary injunction. And so what that means is that the court was asked to immediately stop Dane County from enforcing its order while the litigation continues. And there will continue to be a case processed by the court. But when it issues this kind of temporary injunction, that is a fairly good sign that the court is going to reach a decision in the case that is compatible with that injunctive decision. There are 4 things you have to establish to get an injunction, and they are a reasonable probability of success on the merits, a lack of adequate relief at law, that you need somebody to do something as opposed to award damages to you, that you'll suffer irreparable harm if an injunction is not given, and then finally that the equities favor granting an injunction. I think the 2 strongest components there in analyzing the court's decision are the fact that the court does have to find that the plaintiffs have a reasonable probability of winning the case, and the court does that. The court also finds that there is no adequate remedy at law, so you can't give damages to the petitioners for them to have the relief they seek. They need to have a direct order influencing the behavior of the county in order to have an adequate remedy. Those are 2 fairly powerful things for the court to do, and the court did them in this case. And so there is now a temporary injunction which prevents Dane County from enforcing its order. The part to remember is that there still will be a case processed, and if I were to project on that case, I think we all who have been collaborating on discussing this case agree that it's quite likely the Supreme Court will issue a decision that is consistent with the injunction that it's issued. I think we all also agree that the decision is on fairly narrow grounds having to do with the county order's authority to actually compel schools to close. And I think if you look at the court's decision, the court likens the decision of Dane County to enjoin in-person instruction and essentially require virtual instruction for county schools, views that as exercising authority that Dane County doesn't have. The court talks about the fact in its decision that DHS, who was involved in a prior case with our Supreme Court earlier this year, that DHS specifically has the power to close schools. And the court goes on to say, when we look at the powers of counties to deal with things like pandemics, you don't see that same language there. You don't see that authority to close schools. That's what the parties, of course, were debating was, is that a distinction that makes a difference? The county said, no, it doesn't. We still have the authority, notwithstanding that distinction, to take the position that we can order schools not to provide in-person instruction for those grade levels. And I think the court disagreed with that and said, no, we see this as tantamount to crossing over into closure authority. And for that reason, we're going to issue the injunction because we don't think that is a distinction without a difference. We think the legislature meant to give DHS that authority. We think that the legislature did not mean to give you, Dane County, that authority, and that's why the language is different. So that kind of gives you a technical look at what the court did. I think in the broader context, you still have other authorities that bear on this question. First of all, you still have Governor Evers' order, which is in effect for a short period of time here prospectively in September, unless it's extended. It should be noted that Governor Evers' order is not an issue that was before the court in this case. So the face covering requirements that are part of that order, the social distancing requirements that are part of that order, those are still alive and well because that's not part of this litigation. They might be attacked in a future piece of litigation, but at least for right now, we know that that is not an issue and it's not affected by the court's decision. The other thing to bear in mind is that the court's decision does not, nor does it pretend to usurp the authority of school boards. And school boards, of course, have their own authority to act as their own legislatures. And so when you pass board policy, of course, you are acting in a quasi-legislative capacity. You're passing your own laws for this district. And in that regard, it still continues to be our opinion that a school board has the authority to decide which modalities to use to deliver educational instruction within certain broad parameters. So one never says never to certain propositions, but at the same time, as a general matter, our position is still that a school board theoretically would have the authority to say we want to have virtual instruction, would have the authority to say we want to have in-person instruction, or to have the authority to say we want a combination of the two and here's how we would like to combine them. The point being that that is a policy decision that the Supreme Court's decision leaves untouched. And so for right now, we would continue to hold that a school board has that authority and can make those decisions as you and other boards have. So that's a brief summary. I don't know if you need more information about the court's decision, but I can certainly answer any questions you might
Can I
have.
just add a couple things? So the court's decision also was pretty, as you said, was pretty narrow.
Yeah,
But it didn't negate the entire order that was put out by public health.
that is
So
correct.
the pieces in there that impacted schools with regards to social distancing, gathering sizes, co-curriculars like sports, etc., were untouched by that decision of the court. It was really the open and closing metrics and those decision points that were ruled upon. Is my
Yes, that-
interpretation correct?
Yeah, that's correct. They attacked Section 4D of the order, and that is, as you say, a section of the order that deals with in-person versus virtual instruction. There are any number of components of this order that the petitioners were not asking the court to consider as part of their request for an injunction in the first place. So clearly the petitioners made a very narrow request and didn't include all of the other items you mentioned in their request. So when the court approved the request, it approved of what was being asked for, namely a reversal of Section 4D, rather than throw out the entire order. And that's what the court's injunction does.
Kurt, thanks for being here.
You're welcome, thank you.
How are they defining closing? I mean, that's sort of the, we're providing instruction, we're open for meals, we're doing some things. But that's why I wondered why are they defining it closed?
You know, I think what they're doing is they're not defining it so much as telling you we are certain of what it is not. In other words, they're saying you have DHS with a specific authority to close schools. The counties don't have that specific authority according to the court. Obviously, the counties argued otherwise, but the court said, no, that linguistic difference in your authority makes a difference. And then when they discussed its meaning, they made very, very short work of it. So they pointed out the Department of Health and Health Services has the power to, quote, close schools and forbid public gatherings in schools, churches, and other places to control outbreaks and epidemics. They go on to then say the powers and duties entrusted to local health officers, however, are different. The legislature conspicuously omits the power to, quote, close schools in its grant of authority to local health officers, but local health officers may, quote, forbid public gatherings when deemed necessary to control outbreaks or epidemics. So far, nothing has been said about what it means to close a school. All that's been said is the The Secretary of DHS has the express authority to do it, and you, the county, do not. They go on to say that the county does have the authority to inspect schools, but again point out that the power to close schools is statutorily absent. So we continue to read on the meaning and application of closing schools, but the court again turns us back to the prior case that it handled involving Secretary-designee Palm and used the distinction between Palm's authority and the county's authority to define the term. So I don't think we get any express statement from them about what it is to close a school so much as we have a statement that DHS has the authority to do it and you don't, and that we're not being asked to challenge other aspects of the order apart from the virtual versus in-person instruction issue. And for that reason, the court is essentially determining when you're telling people that they cannot have in-person instruction, you are crossing the line into closure of schools when you do that. And that is about the best definition we have from a fairly generally written decision.
So they're just making a decision on who has the responsibility to, or the authority to close or not close.
I think that's
really what
that
it's
is
coming down
absolutely
to.
correct, yes.
But you're saying that the school district can still impose, they can decide at the district level to close and not close, or to make modifications.
That is correct.
Kirk, was there anything in your read of that decision that if for example, you had, I mean, I agree with Brian's question, the school district has the authority to close schools. I mean, just like we do for other emergencies under this situation, we have the same authority. But does a local public health department have the ability to close an individual school if there were an issue such as a COVID outbreak within one school or one district?
That's a question not answered at all by this decision.
Okay.
So it looks like we have about, if they use the full time, about 60 days before a decision, right? Before the petitioners and the responders have time to provide their information.
I think that's true as far as it goes in terms of the briefing schedules that they dictate to the parties. But our Supreme Court has a habit of giving the parties firm deadlines, but not giving itself firm deadlines. So when the court decides the question is another matter, but I think you're right about the schedule for the parties submitting the briefs.
Does that fall into a time where they're not in session? The beginning of November?
No, they would decide this case. And I think in fairness to the court, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with their decisions, the court has issued reasonably prompt decisions on a number of these cases, so at least everybody knows where they stand.
Did I read correctly or misunderstood? I thought I had read in the paper, the court gave the suitors 20 days to put their cases together and present their case back to the court.
Yeah, that does
But
ring a
that
bell.
wouldn't speed up the 60 days or anything, but it just would get the argument clearer from their perspective.
Yeah, I mean, most of those have to do with the processing of the case on the merits. And so you've got a series of things before they even get to the injunction. I think that's the part you're referring to, where they order petitioners, the petitions for leave to commence an original action granted. They order some briefing schedules be complied with within 20 days of filing of the petitioner's brief. The respondent has to respond, and so forth. So they do a number of things to direct the parties on putting in written arguments on the case, and then also on scheduling oral argument. But that all, of course, happens in the wake of the injunction. The injunction is in place and has been ordered effective now, and then the parties have a chance to brief and argue the case from there. So most of those timelines have to do with arguing the case on the merits and not the injunction that has been decided.
do you think that there, to go back to the, and this is sort of the confusing part, the defining closing schools. Currently now we have athletic participation, we have some club participation, we have, again, food service, we have some students going into the school. Do you foresee that school closure statement coming up for a more better definition of?
I do.
Because I think that's the confusing part of
I
school
do,
closing.
and I'll take that in two parts. I think the first part is, do I expect them to change their mind? No, I don't. It does, however, happen. It has happened where somebody can present a compelling argument on a narrow issue that now everybody knows what it is based on this decision. So it's always possible the Supreme Court could look at that and get one vote, because this is a 4-3 court that issued this decision. And if one vote were to change, this result could change. I think, though, on the second point, you will get exactly that. Both parties are going to have to concentrate their efforts in arguing to the court why this is not a school closure, because I think the county is well aware from this decision that arguing that it is appropriate for the county to close schools probably will not fare well with this court. So the next thing is to maintain, well, this is not in fact an order that closes schools at all. And I think you'll see a far more focused discussion on that point, and in fairness to the court, their injunction orders, like the one we're looking at, tend to be abbreviated because they're trying to get those out in the interest of time. But we probably will see a more considered discussion by the court of what it means in this decision, and the parties are obviously going to be expected to address that issue with the court at greater extent.
Are there any further questions? Thank you so much for coming, Kurt, especially at such short
Thanks for
notice.
having me. Have a good evening.
I'm sure everyone is asking you these questions.
What's that?
I'm sure you've had plenty of practice answering these questions.
Well, you know, it's funny because this one at least is a little new. So, you know, every week we have a new decision, though, it seems. So there's plenty to talk about right now. But again, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
That will then take us on to the next part of number 10, 10B.
I guess one of the pieces that we just have to also, if we stay on 10A, if you will, Dave, just with regards to how that impacts us as a district. I mean, and I think that's the next part is, because that's really the questions I think our public comments we're getting at, those are the questions that I'm getting received, is what does that mean for us as a district? So I just want to kind of reiterate what we had talked about prior, and then I think we've got to just think about how does this change or not change any of those plans that we put forth. So in the previous decisions were based off of those metrics by public health. So that was the K2, 3, 5, 6, 12 spans. And based off of those, we made then decisions to move forward. That's part of what Kirk was here to talk about, was that's what was challenged in the courts, and that metric and that opening and closing piece is the aspect that is now really falls into a recommendation piece from public health more than an order. So that's where you start to get the kind of questions as far as what you are able to do and versus what you choose to do. So that's kind of where that gets framed. But thus far, what we have is that K2 is obviously open and a hybrid. We still have to maintain the social distancing and the class size pieces, so that doesn't change any of that because that's still part of the order. The second part we had talked about was the 3rd and 4th grade being a point that once we met a metric based off of those public health pieces, that we would then bring them in within a period of time. And then the third piece we talked about was kind of review the earliest we would bring in our 5th grade, or our 6th grade, I'm sorry, and on up would be an assessment at the quarter period. So So that was kind of where we landed as part of our decision-making prior, and that was built off of the metrics that were put out by public health. So I think
Mike?
kind of if that's kind of like where we're sitting.
Sure.
Yeah.
I guess I kind of have two questions, or maybe a question. Kind of, when you're saying we, are you talking about the board or the
I'm
administration?
talking about the board. I'm
Okay.
talking about the district.
Okay.
That's-
Because I guess with that, then I actually somewhat disagree with you.
All right.
Because I think we have a vote that was K through 4 in hybrid that effectively was suspended for 2
Thank you.
grades.
Yes, that's
Because of
right.
an order. We didn't actually change plans.
That's
We just
correct.
said, well, shoot, we've got this order and now we
You're
can't do
right.
anything about it.
Oh, good point. Thank you.
So-
No, that's great. I
So,
understand.
so I guess the way I look at it is, as it stands, the plan is still K through 4 in person in a hybrid model with 5 through 12, a decision point later at the court.
Yep.
Like,
No, I appreciate that clarification. You're right. That was the decision. The board's, you're right. To go back, the decision of the board was the K4. And then because of the order that came out from public health, it was put back to the K2. But then that was built off of kind of our plan based off of those metrics moving forward. Thank you, Mike.
I'd like to add, although we didn't, I don't believe we voted on it, there seemed to be consensus that if the metrics allowed us to open, we would do so within a week and a half of the change in metric, looking at possibly the second Monday, if the order came out on a Friday, that sort of thing. Now, the metric hasn't changed. Well, you could argue the metric's gotten worse. Okay, but that's also was a public statement that we discussed at least, and I thought we had consensus on the week and a half concept. And I think that's something we should at least be mindful of as we go forward tonight.
What we had talked about was if, again, it's under the premise of that metric and under the premise that at that point when the metric was met, that public health would put forth a new order. That's not happening any longer. So, but that was built off the premise that once an order was established, that within, I think we were just projecting,
Yeah, we're given
whatever
a
second Monday or
concept,
whatever
right.
Monday after.
Wasn't in
As-
concrete.
Correct. That was what we discussed.
So I think, based on where we have voted K4 hybrid, the rest virtual. We were under order by Dane County to go to K2 because of their metric. Therefore, their metric has disappeared, which would put us back. Our motion is still sitting at K4. So the question becomes, my view would be that if we do nothing, then we should be moving towards K4. Because the one thing that stopped it has disappeared. That said, we do have something we didn't have when we voted, which is a medical advice from the Dane County Health saying do X. We did not have that when we had our initial vote. We also didn't have the Medical Advisory Committee, which has made some comments, but when we were looking at the metric, that was right after Dane County had come out with their thing. So I gotta admit, they kind of started talking about percentages as a better way to look at it than Dane County's number. But they did not give a number because at the point, it didn't seem to matter, since Dane County has stated a number. They will be meeting again on Wednesday. Might be a fun time to start talking about that again. So right now, barring another action by the board, it would seem we would fall under the 2-week deal that in 2 weeks, we could open 3 and 4. But that would require changes in transportation and changes in staffing that will take time and money and effort to get it done.
There should be a question from Randy for administration, so when we shut it down, how long would it take 3-4 to prepare to open again?
And the answer to that is we figure it's 2 weeks. We figure we have to give parents notification that this is what we're doing with the time frame. We also anticipate we're going to have to put a timeline in there where parents can reevaluate whether they're in person or virtual, because that's going to impact the shift. And I anticipate, just given where the current COVID metrics in our county are, it's going to change where people's choices are. So we need a time period, say 3-4 days, where we give people a choice to open it up. And then we've got to lock it down and say, these are your choices, so that we can then look at the staffing aspect of it, the transportation pieces, the logistical pieces. The instructional pieces, I think they've done a really good job of already planning some of those pieces. It's the logistical aspects of them delivering it with the staff, the transportation, et cetera.
Randy, when is the court? Is that mid-October or?
Oh, and that's what Kirk was saying, is that they have these, help me out, Mike, with the correct terms, they're the briefs they have to submit, and then they'll hear the case, but doesn't necessarily mean that they would make a decision in mid-October, I believe is what Kirk was saying.
All they set were briefing deadlines, and it's 30 days for the petitioners, 20 days for the respondents, and then 10 days for another reply from the petitioner. So there's a minimum of 60 days the injunction would be in place for, and that's assuming they make a decision the day the last thing is entered.
Right.
More likely, it's more like 3 or 4 months.
Right, I think that's what Kirk was alluding to.
But I guess what I'm asking is, when is the educational quarter?
Oh, sorry. That's November. Probably the first week in November.
I think third,
November 4th.
fourth.
November 4th?
Yeah.
Well, that's what I thought where our initial discussion was too, is we would make, agree, K4 was what we initially agreed to, but then the rest of it, we weren't gonna jump the gun until court.
Right, there would not be a
Obviously, there's a lot
change
more,
regarding
there's
the-
additional planning in 5, 6, and in high school. So,
Yes,
I
Mark.
think whether we're talking the 512 piece or the 3-4 piece, we can go by what our intent was, but from my perspective, the metrics have changed from when we made those choices. And I'm not certain I feel comfortable making the choice without the support of our medical advisory committee for reopening given the current metrics.
I mean, do you want to close all the schools because they're higher than the metrics said they should be for K-2 too? Much higher. We're not
Dane County,
contemplating
for
closing.
some reason, Dane County seems to ignore that.
Right.
Because their current, last Wednesday, they were at 94.
Right.
And I'm just saying, if we're going to make a decision, I'd like to have the support of our medical ad hoc committee with our decision, not just we here make that's why we formed it. One of the reasons I thought we formed it was that we could be informed by them if it's a prudent thing to do. And it makes it a little bit problematic that they're not meeting until Wednesday, but I would argue that we could ask our principals to start planning, and we may want to convene a week from tonight to make that decision based upon what they come up with.
Would you want to make a motion for it? Because I think unless there's a motion overturning the previous one, we currently have a motion that's been passed and accepted that would require a certain course of action. If we wanted to delay or change that course of action, it would require a motion to do that. I think what you're suggesting, Mark, is a motion to take this to the medical advisory committee and then schedule a meeting for the 21st to look at their advice on any further opening beyond K2 at this time.
Is it reasonable, as you met with this group, now we have no metrics to rely on at all. We open, what will close us down? Is it, an outbreak in our district? Is it, lack of subs, lack of what, I think before we go to opening more, we need to have some, I think, idea of how do we pull it back and how do we keep them safe and what's our metric to close?
If you look at the minutes from the last meeting of the committee, which is a little further down, which I was hoping to get to before we got into this too deeply, but they have a discussion of possible metrics. And in there, the committee did discuss what would trigger it, and they were looking at percentages based on individual schools even, and looking at what
Just
could
our
happen in one
district,
school might not cause you to shut down another school, like Arboretum versus the high school would be totally different views, mainly because in an elementary school, I believe they said they were considering that, oh yeah, there was comment that basically you can quarantine easier in a K-4 level than you can in 5 through 12 because of how they move classes more. And that it might be possible that you wouldn't have to shut a K-4 down at the same number you would a high school. A high school, a lower percentage might cause you to close the whole school, where in an elementary school it won't, because you're more segregated, and just closing an individual classroom would be more effective in an elementary than it would be in a high school. Now, they didn't go super deep into it because we had just gotten the Dane County numbers. But that is something they could look at this Wednesday, in a better chance now that we know where we're at. Yes, Brian?
But weren't we talking about that it would be that Dane County Health would come in and shut you down before?
There was
Well, that sort of puts a
consideration
wrinkle
that,
into it now where they cannot shut down
right,
those schools.
everybody thought at that point in time that Dane County Health would probably shut you down before you would shut yourself down.
Right.
But now, we know that's not the case, or likely not to be the case, so we do have to get to that number.
So now it's going to be on us to figure out a metric of our own. Unless, because I'm assuming that Dane County Public Health would be quicker to shut us down than having go through the state DHS department. I think they're more boots on the ground than.
And I think there's a distinction in the statute too, that potentially public health could shut a school down, but it's only if they go in and they look and they say it's unsanitary. And we have to realize that the statute was written almost 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And they were probably talking about things like vermin infestations, not coronaviruses.
Right.
So that's not great for what they need to apply it for, but they theoretically still could shut the school. And I think the distinction is they can't just blanket shut schools down.
Well, the problem is, because it was written 100 years ago, there's still going to be another group that's going to say, the Supreme Court just ruled on this, and as a school district, we can't keep doing this. Back and forth, because it's getting tiring for the community, for our teachers, for our students, and everything.
Yeah.
We have to come up with our own metrics to say, this is how we're going to work it. And if they do come in, that's great, that's fine, but we can't rely on this anymore. It's frustrating.
And we can use their numbers, but we can't rely on them to make the decision.
Dane County has said they're going to keep publishing the number, and their metric is there. You just get to decide if you want to use it or not.
I think you've got a couple, from what I've seen, you have a couple options. You could adopt the public health metric if you choose to. And that's, as Dave said, they're going to keep updating that. They're going to keep utilizing, and the data will still be there. To Mark's point, they did not close down K2, and the metric went above that because they were also, from my understanding, and I'm putting a bit of my own words to it, not theirs, is they were looking to see what the next few weeks were going to bring before they made some decision on it, because they were looking at other pieces too. So that's one part of it. I was sharing with Dave, there's another school district in Wisconsin that did adopt different metrics. They used the ones that were part of the Harvard Global Health Institute. The Harvard Global Health Institute, where it was also part of the metrics that Public Health Medicine Dane County utilized. And then certainly there's, as Dave shared, there's the conversations that we started just with the medical advisory group, and that was really kind of posed to how large of an outbreak within a school. Is it one person, two person, a classroom, two classrooms, that really precipitates needing to close down in order to quarantined at school or classroom. So that was kind of what we were having that dialogue off of, but it wasn't built off of like a regional metric. It was built off of more of a experience that was happening within a school.
I guess if we come up with our own metrics, what is our liability?
Well, I think it's kind of as Kirk stated, and you have the board has the ability to create and adopt whatever metric or policy you choose to. Right now, there's not a metric that's adopted, that's an order by the county. As far as a liability standpoint, I mean, I would say, just to give you an example, opening all of our schools up for all 4,300 kids would be outside of the public health order. That would put us in jeopardy from a liability standpoint. As long as we were within the social distancing to the degree possible, the group sizes, et cetera, and doing our best to navigate that, then if we choose a metric that decides opening or closing, I don't think that's an issue.
I may be in error. It was my understanding that if we did not follow public health in County Madison, that our insurance company said they would not cover us.
True.
So is that, no matter what we decide, are we going to have to?
Because that's the part of the
So
court
the-
challenge that
Okay,
negated.
so the order, it was the order, not necessarily the metrics. That
Well, what they did was they overturned that part
that
of the
specific
order.
order. Okay,
So that part of the order is no longer enforceable.
okay, all right.
Mike?
I don't want to neglect discussing it because it seems like we've gotten a lot of comments from the public about an overall plan for everyone other than K through 4. I mean, obviously we're talking about K through 4 because they're the ones that are the most imminent need, and that the Harvard plan that you brought up, Randy, talks about the K through 5.
Yeah,
K
it's
through
got a
5.
little different numbers, right?
Close enough, but
Yeah.
we're still kind of, this wasn't lost on anyone in the community that when we had our 7 6-hour meetings, we really didn't talk about over half the students for almost the entire time.
Right.
And that's what we're hearing from people on is, I guess, the overall question of what is the plan? And if we're talking about metrics, that's part of the plan. But I mean, I'm a lawyer, that's a sales job, and I always kind of treat my job here as kind of like, how do you sell the district, kind of what the plan is. And I find myself not knowing really what the plan is from today until November. I mean, I know there is one, I know there's stuff that the administration's doing it, but I don't know what it is.
Sure.
And if I don't know what it is, I assume Tom and Jan on the street don't know what it is either. So if we can get anything out of this, it's communicating what the steps we're taking to get everyone back at some point. I think that would probably calm the waters a decent.
I mean, the challenge, I think, Mike, is Rebecca, can I just have you pull up my beginning of school year report and if you can scroll, keep going through it. I don't know which slide it is. It's number 5. Let me just talk to this for a second. So, and this partially was just kind of reviewing some of the things we already did, but I think the piece that's kind of where we're at is, and this gets to a bit of what you're talking about, Mike, is do we have a plan for all of them? Yes, but they were built off, we were working very strongly for the last number of weeks. And I'll say the challenge for us as an administration and staff is trying to figure out, are we open, are we closed, what's the metrics that we're using, and what are the timelines for when we might hit the metric. That was a big piece for us. So if you start to take a look at our initial decision was the K4 piece. That piece has been very thoroughly worked out and vetted out with our administration and to a degree with our staff as far as how we could do that. Hence, once we make that decision that we're ready to bring 3rd and 4th grade back, we feel it can happen within that 2-week time frame. The biggest piece with that is the logistics of parents changing their mind between in-person and virtual, and then the impact of that on staffing and the impact of that decision also on transportation and needing to really look at our routes. That's really what takes the 2 weeks period. We go to 5, 6, they're also as we go back, we agreed in that AM/PM hybrid model. What we had talked about previously was even if we met that metric sometime during September, that we were going to look at bringing back the 5th grade at that point. And I would say in this case, we would do both, 5th and 6th grade at the quarter. I think there's some logistical pieces we have to work out. There's also some hiring we have to do. And there's also pieces that as we bring more back, we have to make sure that we have the staffing to make sure that we are addressing not only the needs of the kids and the teachers during the day, we also have to make sure that we can address some of the cleaning aspects. So that's the other aspect of it as far as making sure we can address those parts of the program. So 5th and 6th grade, we had targeted the quarter. I still think that makes sense. If you're looking at 7-12, we had groups working this summer on both the virtual and the hybrid pieces. Once there was a decision that 7-12 was going to be, particularly 7-12 was going to be virtual, the staff put a lot of efforts into their remote instruction, which made sense because they wanted to do that to the highest quality they could. So they set aside temporarily the planning for the hybrid. Doesn't mean that there's nothing that's happened there, but their efforts, we're in the first week of school still, was then to revisit the hybrid coming once we got school launched, and then to be able to work out the logistical pieces of that. That's honestly one of the hardest parts of our process because we're dealing with not just a cohort of kids that are taking the same class, we have kids taking all different kinds of classes. And then looking at, as we have people choosing in-person and hybrid, it's not as simple as the elementary where we can kind of look at a 4th grade and then divvy up the staff the same way because we have different classes that kids are choosing into and we have to look at how we're going to staff that. So that one is not a 2-week turnaround. That's probably at a minimum the quarter turnaround in order to make that happen. But the further we delay that part of it, and I know we've had some conversations with secondary already, that this is a piece we're going to have to start engaging on now, as opposed to when we looked at the last week, this was a piece they were going to kind of wait a bit on because the metrics were nowhere close to 19 of bringing them back. But they had some time to put some of that planning together. I see Tim's just joined us in the room and he's worked most closely with secondary. But I think, Mike, that gets to some of the questions that you're asking is what's the plan for secondary and is there anything happening? There certainly is, but it partially has been paused because the metrics weren't anywhere close to us coming back in October. So we put our efforts towards the virtual delivery model to make sure that we delivered that as strong as we could at the beginning of the year. And now we're at a point where we need to start kind of looking at the point when we decide to bring folks back, we have some work to do to make that logistically lined up. And I see Tim walked in. Does that seem fair with her? You and I were talking about that this afternoon. So, I mean, the pieces that we kind of look at in addition is, I mean, the order piece Kirk was talking about, we initially, going back to kind of, I think, Mike, where you were talking about what was our initial motion, also included that enhanced remote. The enhanced remote was not only special ed, but it allowed our staff at different levels to bring in kids. And you received emails from our tech ed department and some of our other CTE courses saying those are best done hands-on. The enhanced remote allows for those things to happen. And I think that would be positive for us to be able to jump into and be able to do. But the parental shifts and the staff accommodation pieces, that's some of the logistical work we have to do. And then the high school aspect is just trying to determine how we're going to staff the classes given where we know kids are going to choose either remote or in person and how we do that. And then the job positions, I mean, as Brian shared in closed session just real briefly, and I was going to talk about it here, until we do have a need for staff. The paraprofessionals that are currently not filled is based on kind of what we have right now. Because to hire additionally, if we were going to stay K2, would require then us to kind of furlough or move people off. So we just didn't fill some of those. But it's also an issue, we don't have applicants for those positions. So that's a piece that we're gonna have to hit the ground hard to recruit folks for that and let the community know we need help in that area. That's gonna help us not only, because we also have some of our custodial positions that we need to fill. And part of what some of these folks are gonna also be helping us with is kind of that all hands on deck piece as far as helping us, particularly between groups, between classes, or however we're gonna do it, helping us with some of the cleaning aspects, particularly at the K-6 level. So that's kind of the broad, high-level picture, Mike, of kind of what the plan is. The deepest amount of work that has to happen yet to bring kids back in person is that hybrid planning 7-12. The other pieces, I think, are definitely on a track for us to be able to do. They just have some time pieces and logistical pieces to work out before we can do it.
You know, I think to that point though, you know, we've got a plan for 3-4, 2 weeks after we give you the go-ahead, you go ahead. 5-6 is second quarter, you know, and we've been talking all summer,
Yep.
you know, about it, you know, and it's been very vague, you know, on the high school, you know, to Mike's point. And I think what we got to do is draw a line in the sand and say, January 1st or after Christmas break, high school is coming back, you know, or, you know, somehow we have to give the public some type of timeline because, you know, we have been talking, you know, we have been planning, we have been creative, and, you know, now we've got to start, you know, laying the benchmarks down.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that, Jack, but what we were working off before wasn't a timeline, it was a metric.
Yeah.
And now we're off of that metric, and we either have to decide on a new one, or we've got to think about, and I think part of what we're going to have to define here, and this is a piece Tim and I were talking about this afternoon, is if the board said tonight you want to open up 7-12, how much time do we need in order to do that? And that's a piece that I don't have a solid answer for you tonight, but it's one that I've got to bring you at a near point meeting for us to be able to articulate that. Because when you start to look at those, there are two different types of timelines. A metric driven one, you're watching the metric and you kind of know where you're going. And then you start to jump in. And now we've got to start looking at what's the actual timeline if you say go that we can open up. So if you said tonight, can I open up first quarter or at the end of the first quarter? I can't answer that for you definitively tonight, but that's a piece we need to get to.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Pre-quarter, was it 9?
Yeah.
We had a definitive timeline. We said second quarter. From my perspective, whether we hold to that or not, I still think we need something more than us here saying, I feel safe with what we're doing. I want a guidance, whether we're going to agree to the board to look at the Dane County numbers and say, okay, pull our own numbers based upon medical support from the advisory committee using the Harvard thing. I would like something that's going to guide us. I feel this. Our community is split 50-50 in terms of the number of people who want us to open but don't because of medical issues. And then you have the virtual people who, under any condition right now, want to be virtual. And then you have a large segment who want the face-to-face. But we really don't know how large that face-to-face group is anymore, given what's happened since order number 9 came out. And so I'm content sticking with our original goals of second quarter for 5-12 and 3-4 ASAP within a 2-week frame, as long as we can get the go-ahead from somebody who knows more about this than I do. I mean, I wasn't happy to see that metric for 19 for the high school. I said, well, we'll never open with that metric. Okay, but if we're not going to use 19, is 42 a reasonable number based from our medical people? I feel very I feel paralyzed to make that decision without some informed medical advice from our group. If they can give us an informed, they don't have to make the decision for us, but I think we need them to give us a recommendation that we can then act on. And that will guide us on November 2nd. Can we open up? We want to do it November, second quarter, but it doesn't look good right now.
I gotta say, my vote the whole time was to go with whatever the medical community said was reasonable. And I voted that way since the first vote. And the bad thing about this Supreme Court decision is it said, we don't care about the medical advice, we care about the statutory law. That's their job. I get it. The problem is, it doesn't answer the question of what's medically safe and appropriate to do. It threw that out the window and just said, no, you can't take the medical advice. Dane County cannot give medical advice in a mandatory manner. It's basically what it did. So what we have now is Dane County's medical advice as a recommendation. And to sit there and say, we're going to sit there and open up the entire school district based on the fact that a Supreme Court made a legal decision that Dane County medical people cannot force us to do anything, we're basically ignoring the medical advice that we've been given. Now, I like the ad hoc committee. That's why we started it, is because it's medical people in our community who have expertise in this area. I don't see a problem. In fact, I'll make the motion that we meet again on the 21st to decide whether we will continue and open up grades 3 and 4. And until then, we'll keep it at K2. We'll let the medical team make their recommendation. We will then consider that recommendation in 1 week and go from there.
Is there a problem with just limiting it to 3, 4 with a recommendation, or would you like the ad hoc committee or the medical committee to give us some kind of a metric to use or standard to use, suggest that? No. I think that's what Mark
That is on the
saying.
agenda for this coming Wednesday.
So,
But if we sit here and do nothing today, based on our last motion, oh, by the way, it requires a second for my motion. I'm sorry.
Second.
Okay. If we do anything today, we wouldn't have listened to them. We wouldn't give them a chance to give us that advice.
right,
If we give them their meeting on Wednesday, it's already on the agenda for them to discuss that metric. We now have what La Crosse has done. We have the Supreme Court decision. Last time they met, there was no need for them to go into super detail on that yet because Dane County had taken that away.
but what I'm
Now
asking
there
is,
is.
can they give us more than just 3rd and 4th grade? Can they give us the basis for what they're going to do, what we can do down the road?
Yeah, I mean, we still have, we're going to consider everything based on the quarter. That hopefully they'll be able to get there. But let's be honest, Dane County and the state health department has been working on this how long? It took them how long to come up with one answer? It legally got blown up. I mean, we can't
But
really.
I'm worried about
hopefully they'll
saying,
come
when
up.
you're worried about the public, if you're saying the timeline is the quarter, we don't want the timeline to be the quarter if the metrics aren't there. And so
Right.
we need to know what our metrics are in conjunction with the timeline. And I think what you're saying for the 3rd and 4th grade, they can get that going. But I want to be clear that the public doesn't think at the quarter,
Right.
bang, it's all going to happen based on,
No, it's definitely been the intent when forming that
I think
committee.
it's what you're
I
asking.
think one of the things that you can do is you can sit down and say, okay, just like we did with 3, 4, once the metrics met, 2 weeks after that, we're open, because it takes us that long. If you don't tie it to the quarter, but if you do tie it to metrics, how long is it going to take to open that 5, 6 up? How long is it going to take to do 7, 12? I don't think we're in a position to say we can do that in 3 weeks.
No, not in
You
the
know,
position to do that.
and we've been talking about this the entire summer. And I understand the metrics have come down to the point, where, we don't have to work on it. But, I think we have to to really put a plan together, to Mike's point, to say, when the metrics are here, we're ready to execute.
But Jack, the metric was the quarter, is what we've set out there as our timeline. So our planning process was lined up to address the quarter.
Yep.
So when you look at that, it wasn't that we're not doing anything. It's that we were lining our work up so that it could align with that quarter, knowing that we were starting virtually. That's where the efforts went to. We're still in the second week of school. And now we have to shift to that piece. And Tim can speak more specifically to it because he's worked closely with it.
Yeah, and I want to, reiterate that, your decision as a board, from back in August and is still in place today, is we're aiming to go and offer a hybrid option at the intermediate. Now that'd be a split day hybrid, and the split week hybrid for the middle school and high school effective the first quarter. So in terms of what we're going to be working on as staff, that's never gone away. Now, when the Dane County guidelines were in effect and we didn't have the injunction, yes, you look at that 19 and you say, well, when we get to the point of where we would move into more active planning for the hybrid, we may need to look at that. We may not need to push on it as hard. But the reality is, even when we were before the Dane County guidelines, our intention was to take the first half of September and really focus on the remote learning components. Because first of all, that was how we were starting the year. And secondly, those remote learning components are still going to be a key part of our success when we move to hybrid. I mean, first of all, we'll have a certain number of students, we don't know how many, that will be in remote. Their parents are going to choose remote at the quarter mark when we make the transition. And what the hybrid entails is the students are going to be in school approximately half-time, and they're going to be remote approximately half-time, still working on what we've been putting in place already. And this is an oversimplification, but if you look at the amount of time students spend in synchronous learning today, basically 2 days in a class, they're going to have once a week that similar amount of time per class, but instead of being synchronous video, it'll move to live in person for students that are doing the hybrid. I mean, it's a rough equivalence, but it's still an equivalence. Where we are going to run into some challenges, and this is the kind of the core of the planning process, is for the hybrid, we're going to have to do what we've done for the kindergarten, first, and second grade classes, which is reduce the size of the sections to bring the kids in to maintain the social distancing. Right now, if I'm teaching world history, I'm in my synchronous session and I have a full section, 20-some kids on the other side of Zoom in that synchronous session of world history. When we move to hybrid, we'll be taking that section and we'll be splitting it in two. So some will be on one day, some will be on others, just like we've done kind of with the split day in the primary grades to get our social distancing down. So where the biggest challenges are going to be is, in some respects, the same challenges we've had with K-1-2 and getting all the sections to fit is, how will singletons shake out? How will numbers shake out for some of our bigger sections? Will we have to adjust some things? That's going to be, and I'm sure we'll have some surprises in the planning process that we'll navigate in the next 6 weeks as we try to get to the second quarter mark. But that's really where we know the lifting is going to be. So what we've done up to this point, focusing on the remote, is not really to the detriment of getting ready to launch hybrid at the second quarter, because everything we've been focusing on is still going to be continuing. It's just going to be, what will that kind of real-time piece look like? It'll shift from Zoom to in-person, except for the kids that are opted into virtual.
So Dave, I guess since we have your motion, it's got a second, we discuss just the motion in general. I have a second, I think that's one thing to add. So, to your motion, I guess the way I see it going is you're extending out this 2-week period to basically 3 weeks for the benefit of giving us some cover in an unlikely scenario. And I'll say why I think it's an unlikely scenario. I don't think the medical ad hoc committee is going to tell us really anything different. And I think there's 4 reasons why they won't really tell us to do something different. One, no one's really objecting to K through 2 right now. Same thing with public health. Randy, you could probably tell me, is anyone on the ad hoc committee emailing in saying, holy cow, these numbers are terrible, you better shut it down? So no. No one's talking about how it's a danger for those kids in 3-4 right now either. We should note that the kids and the staff in our buildings are not the same as the same people who are having this dramatic outbreak downtown right now. Kids are not going out to bars, are not hanging out at parties, are not congregating in dorm rooms that are not cleaned as well as they should be. So there is a different risk group. And finally, I think it was mentioned in a couple of letters too, that UW explicitly came out and said that in-person instruction is not what's causing this outbreak. And they're not seeing any evidence of any transmission in in-person instruction. It's entirely what's happening outside of the school's control. So I guess I don't anticipate the medical committee doing anything different other than saying, yeah, the numbers have gone up and we don't live in a bubble, but all the things I just said. So I don't want to kick this out another week for no reason. We should absolutely be listening to them. And I anticipate that they came in on Wednesday and they said, Randy, you got to put the brakes on this. Tell the board, don't do it. Administration and staff aren't going to do anything until next Monday anyway. And then we probably change our minds. But I don't see them saying anything that's going to change our minds on Wednesday that we don't already know right now. So that's why I'm against your motion, but I understand that.
So, yes, he does bring up a valid point. We should be discussing the motion.
I would like
Since
to
there isn't one on the
amend the
floor.
motion.
Hmm?
I would like to amend the motion.
You can make an amendment.
I would like to include enhanced remote in the motion. Because that was actually part of the original plan before Order 9 came out.
Have we started bringing kids in?
So not as fast as we had planned, because when the order went into effect, Joan, one of the, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about the levels, but one of the things was that we had been hoping to do the enhanced from the beginning, starting with special ed and then moving in. The initial guidance around the order was no kids coming in at all. Within a few days, we got the go-ahead to bring students in for individualized testing for, IEPs, 504s, pathways, things like that. The whole question of could we bring students in small groups for special education services took a little longer to filter out. And so we've only started doing that now.
Today was the first stage.
And so our thinking prior to the order was we would have the special education groups in first, learn from those schools with the older students what was involved with knowing who was in the building, the logistics of the health checks in bigger facilities, and so on and so forth. And then we would move to the next step, which would be bringing general education students in, shop, art, labs, things like that. So, from our perspective, it's coming up as a next step, but it's a little delayed because we've been delayed getting the special education phase in first, which is the first piece, and we need to learn a little bit from that before we move on to the next step. And, one thing on the planning is, you plan so you're prepared. If something happens down the road where circumstances dictate going slower, that doesn't cause the schools any trouble. We just keep doing what we're currently doing. But we need to move forward with planning now, so if circumstances allow us to hit the quarter target, we're ready to go.
Okay, so Mark had made a motion about enhanced learning. I want to make clear, my motion was about delaying opening K3, was delay opening 3 and 4 until a decision on the 21st based on the ad hoc committee. Are you saying delay enhanced learning?
No, I thought
Also-
you, okay, I misunderstood.
Okay.
I thought there was the idea was we were deciding to open next Monday, 3/4.
Oh, no, the motion is to delay going into that automatic 2-week opening window until we hear from the ad hoc committee making a decision next Monday to start the 2-week period.
Can I ask a point? And that goes back to what Mike said. Mike, what I was hearing between what you were saying was that regardless of what direction the ad hoc committee goes, and let's just kind of play this out, is the first step we're going to have to do is be going back to our 3-4 parents and see who's in person, who's remote. So your point, I think what I was hearing you say was, can you start that now regardless of the ad hoc committee?
Right.
And then the ad hoc committee is going to make a recommendation or have some input, of which we'll revisit next week. But by the end of this week, we could at least know where people were. Was that what you were saying?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, whatever you would do in the next 2 days, just keep doing it. And obviously, if the medical committee comes in and says, pump the brakes, you're going to pump the brakes.
Right. And then we can come back on the 21st with that piece from the ad hoc committee. We can tell us the status of our planning piece, and we can go from there. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess, can I rescind my
Yeah.
amendment then?
Okay. Getting back to your point, Mike, the reason I think this is important is I understand our kids are not going out and hanging out in bars. But as we know, many of the UW students have left campus. One of them moved in right next to me. And it's like, that's fine. That's what's going to happen. So their effect, the reason it's a Dane County order is it does affect most of the county. And while our kids aren't going to bars, we've seen 3 high schools shut down right around us already, and now an elementary school in Janesville today. So it is happening. They are shutting down. There are problems. Not every school that's open is shut down. But to sit there and say 3 high schools and 1 elementary school have closed within the very first week, I think you do need a metric before you start going any further, since we lost the Dane County one. And again, I'm always back to, it's about the medical, and the Supreme Court was all about legal. That doesn't tell us how to safely run a school. It just says you need to figure it out. Brian?
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, we put together the medical ad hoc committee for this reason, to get their input. Unfortunately, it's too bad we don't have meetings on Wednesday, and we flip-flop this stuff, so, but I agree. We also, I don't know if you got the Whitewater announcement today, warning that if it keeps going the way it is, Whitewater is going to virtual. So let's not get to that point. La Crosse is going to virtual. It's happening, and these kids are going to come home across the state. So, at a time when we were making decisions, things were looking great. Things were starting to improve. This is the worst it's been. And now we're wanting to talk about reopening and stuff like that. We also have to make sure that it's safe. And so that's why they might not give us specific metrics. I doubt they're going to. But we should at least hear them out on Wednesday to get their opinion. That's why we put this together. That's why they're taking their time to come in. So we need to respect that and wait. So I agree with you.
You have a comment, Chuck?
Well, I guess what I'd be curious is what are the metrics that they're using? What are the metrics that Kimberly, have you looked and talked with these other districts as well?
Some have them, like La Crosse, where they've adopted certain metrics. Some of them, it's simply
Is
talking
that
to their
across university, or is that?
No, this is School District of La Crosse, K-12. They've adopted the Harvard pieces. You have other districts that have, I think there was a metric in Jefferson County that they put forth. That's kind of a guide. And some are, the guidance they're getting from a public health perspective is minimal to none. And they're just making decisions based on kind of what they're feeling and what their decisions sitting around the table like we are tonight. There's not necessarily a metric that's tied to every decision that's open. But yeah, I mean, those are all pieces that's part of why we're all struggling with this. When I talk to like our Dane County superintendents, that's where stuff like this comes out of, is everybody's in the same place right now, looking for kind of what's the piece that can help us navigate where we're at. The Harvard one's been out for a bit here. It's not a new aspect. There's nothing really magical about it. There's not a whole lot out there, Jack. That's to be honest.
So Dave, are we going with, do we need to call the question again and what you've got on the table? Is that what
We're currently discussing the motion. If you'd like to call the question, you can.
I would.
Okay, call the question. Is there a second to call the question?
Second.
There's a second. So no discussion on calling the question. All we do is vote to basically end discussion. All those in favor of ending discussion say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. And so we've ended discussion. So now we are voting on the motion, which is a motion to basically delay opening 3 and 4 until a decision on the 21st. Waiting for the medical advisory committee to weigh in. And on the 21st, just to be clear, if we decide to open 3 and 4 on the 21st, there would still be the 2-week period before that would happen, in order to give the district time to survey the parents for a couple of days and then start changing busing and everything. So it would be, what would be the date then? The 28th, it'd be October, the first week of October.
I thought that's what we just said. Randy could be having the people do this week, so part of it's done by the time we come in. But this first week could have.
I mean, there's two options. You either delay it, just like what Dave is saying, or you kind of are putting out. You still have the problem you have is you're going to need to know that answer so that you can start you need a hard answer to start moving kids. But can you get preliminary information that helps us? Certainly. But I still think you're going to need the 2 weeks in order to get all the logistical pieces after it, because you need a finalized, and to be honest, some folks are going to wait until that final decision comes, because that's what we've seen through some of the other
Okay,
pieces.
makes sense.
And we won't make that hard answer until the 21st.
The 21st.
So the
So
21st.
it wouldn't open until October.
If you vote no on this motion, the hard answer is done. We're back with the original motion that was made weeks ago. Basically, 3 and 4 would start to open up right now. And that would mean 2 weeks from now, it would be open. So that all said, I think we should do this by name vote, just to make sure we know the exact number. Mark?
Aye.
Jack?
Aye.
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 Joan? Mike? Aye. So that's going to give the Wednesday meeting of the medical committee a lot of interest.
So Randy, so we don't lose it in the discussion, can we assume since order 9 is now illegal, that was the impetus for not pursuing the remote, enhanced remote? Do we need to make a motion to move that forward, or can we just move it forward? And start having plans made to start.
The enhanced remote was that got changed per that last order. I mean, that's a piece that we still have interest in moving forward with and continuing. We're starting off with special ed today. That took off. So I mean, if the boards, and I think it goes to what Tim was saying, we were looking at kind of building it up, starting off with this few special ed kids, and then over the course of the next few weeks, we'll start looking at how we can do that in more areas. And my hope is that we're able to continue to work and plan around that.
Okay.
So I think, since that was part of the original motion and that hasn't been changed in any
No,
way,
there's no need to change
they're
it.
still empowered and
Yeah.
the board is directed it to happen.
So we're able to move ahead with planning around the enhanced remote. Is
As
that
you can work it out.
clear with Everybody's good with that? All right, thank you.
I do think there's one other consideration that some parents have brought up, that due to the change in Dane County's order, is co-curriculars. That was a recommendation. They had a standing order of how you could run them, but they basically, all they gave you was just basically 3 different levels of how to look at co-curriculars. As of the last vote on this, we decided to only allow the ones that are low risk.
That part of the order is still in place though, Dave, I believe.
But, so you're still barred from doing the other ones?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, then that's
That
my
order, yeah, they had nothing
misunderstanding.
to do with
Yeah.
So there really is no vote we could have done in any way on
No.
co-curriculars,
No.
because that was brought up by multiple parents.
No,
So just to make
I
that clear.
believe that the only part of the order that the Supreme Court took up was the piece with regards to the open and closing, which was tied to those metrics.
So the co-curriculars is still barred. in Dane
Because
County.
that's still considered sports recreation, that part of the order is still in place.
Okay. All right then. So now we can go back to the agenda of XB, which is school district face mask policy and the state order.
Yeah. So a couple things that Brian asked for this to kind of be on our agenda here tonight, just so that we could revisit. The state order, I believe, comes to its ending date, I believe, is the end of September the 28th or something of that nature. The governor's office has not come forward and stated that whether they're going to re-up that motion or not, or that order or not. There's 2 things I think that are in place. One, Public Health Madison-Dane County does have a mask order in place. That's very much consistent with what the state's was. And from our conversation with them last Friday, they're not intending on lifting them. The second part is that we do have this within our policies, our COVID policies, and more specifically, we have the 3 tiers of PPE that people have access to, and we've shared out that Annie has pushed out to staff and to students with regards to our requirements for PPE. So I don't think, even if the state masking order went away, we're covered under 2 pieces, one by Public Health Madison-Dane County, and second by our own policies.
Randy, are there many kids that are coming in and getting exemptions to the mask order?
Kurt just walked in. I mean, he's the one who's worked really through those exemptions. I think it's extremely few.
Few?
In fact, I believe even many of our medical providers are not approving any of those exemptions from a medical perspective.
To date, I have not received any medical exemption requests for a medical condition, but we do have some students who are not wearing a mask because of the nature of their disability. And so we do have, I would say, under 10 spread across the district at this time.
And you have a few of those, Kurt, just to clarify, that maybe not be able to wear a mask in its normal form, but have like one of your bucket hats on
Correct.
as a shield in front. So there's something that we're able to try to provide and give them different opportunities to participate.
Yeah, again, while that bucket head doesn't replace a face covering, it's better than nothing. At least that's how we're approaching it. And we're also working, I'll just add, we're also working on any student who is not able, because of their disability, to wear a mask. We are working on getting them to wear a mask. We're treating it as a daily activity, a daily living skill, and trying to teach them to be able to wear it.
Are these students in the regular classrooms, or are they one-on-one?
The vast majority of them are in the special education classroom, but there are a few that are in the general education classroom.
Okay.
That's all. Yep, that's
Yeah,
it.
thank you.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to make it clear for everyone.
Yep.
All right, next is an update on the substitute teacher usage.
I'm going to ask Brian to step forward. This was just a question the board asked at a previous meeting with regards to substitute teacher usage. Rebecca, if you can pull up the memo that's included in board book, that's the piece that we've shared with our administration and our staff, and I'll ask Brian to step forward and just kind of walk through kind of what our what our protocols are, what our process is for securing a substitute, and because we do have two different models here, we have remote instruction and we have in person. And just because of those nuances, we've had to really rethink about how we do our substitute teacher duties.
Yeah, thank you, Randy.
Rebecca.
You know, obviously, when we were all delivering in the same in-person model, it was you know, it was a very simple policy. If the teacher was unable to be there to be, you know, in the building to supervise their students, they you know, if they had students, they got a substitute. In order for us to pay a substitute, somehow a day was being taken. Now, as we have some students being in a totally virtual delivery model, we have teachers delivering to them virtually, and we have other students in person and teachers meeting with them in person. We did have to set up a system that allowed us to support students, supervise students, and continue the instruction. And what we found is, as we were looking to set this up prior to the start of school, was that there is a lot of logistical challenges with finding a substitute, a short-term substitute, for a virtual classroom. There's the mechanics of how do you get them the login information that they need to various subscriptions that we have, whether that's the medium that you're delivering or some of the apps that you're using, or the information of how to contact the students. And another barrier was that substitutes are not uniformly trained in terms of a background, and so their skill set for their ability to deliver on these different platforms varies. And so when we started to, you know, when we started to run into that, how can we make sure that we have someone who is able to connect to kids, deliver the lesson as intended? What we found is that the best teacher is our teacher, which, you know, is probably not news to anyone, but in terms of how we can still continue to keep that teacher working with our students, this is the solution that we came to. If a teacher has a virtual classroom of students and they're not able to come into the building, and there's several different scenarios that we could identify that. You know, they have to be somewhere else during the day. You know, they've taken a personal day, or they had an appointment, a medical appointment of some kind. You know, they're ill, or they have someone in their family that's ill. Every day, all of our staff take the daily health check digitally, and it either clears them to come in and work, or it directs them to stay off site. Not all reasons for someone being off site would incapacitate them, and so someone could be directed to be off site but still be well enough to work. And then obviously the situation that you can run into as well is someone is quarantined because of a contact with another individual, or they're quarantined because of their own illness, but perhaps asymptomatic. And so in those cases, what we've set up is that the teacher, if able to and can work at home, they deliver from home. Obviously that would mean that they have the technology available to them there, and they can keep their lessons going as if they were delivering from our classroom. If they are able to continue working, they do not take a sick day or a leave day, because they are still working. If they are unable to deliver the synchronous learning, the via video learning, second best option is to find a peer teacher that can pick up that class for them. And so that would be combining two virtual groups into one. And if that's the case, the teacher that takes on additional students, we follow the handbook provisions from the past, which is if you take on another teacher's class, you get to time card that at $20 per hour. Since we're paying a second teacher to do that, the first teacher takes a sick day. And I'll come back to what a sick day means at the very end, because there are two different really types of sick days, I guess. And then the third option is that there's not another teacher to take on that lesson or take on that group. And we certainly have had teachers that have been doing this for years. They record a lesson in advance, the night before, the day before, and then they push that out to their students along with work, and the students, get a not interactive, but at least a chance to hear directly from their student, or teacher, excuse me. And then the fourth option is the teacher pushes out additional asynchronous work. So there would be asynchronous work to replace the interactive portion of the lesson, and there is already asynchronous work that's part of every day. So there would be really two pieces of asynchronous work as well. And so that, again, the teacher would take a sick day for that. And as I mentioned before, in terms of talking about a sick day, as you all are aware, every employee is given paid sick leave from our district, a day per month. And the other option is if it is a COVID-related illness. So that means that someone has been diagnosed or directed by a medical provider or a public health entity that this is COVID-related. They have access to use the emergency paid sick leave, which is the federal leave that is granted to all workers. And it's up to 2 weeks of paid sick leave that does not come out of their personal Waunakee Community School District bank. And so because that is unique, and then there's certainly details related to that about what is eligible, and it's also an option to employees. As an employer, we can't tell someone to take a sick day or take an EPSL day. If they are unable to, if they're unable to work, we can dictate that they take a sick day, but they tell us which one that they would like it designated, because that's their right within the federal Families First Corona Response Act.
So that process, we've pushed out to staff, and we've pulled together kind of administratively, given the in-person and the virtual dynamics that we're working with.
Yes.
Any questions for Brian on how we're managing our substitutes this year as we start off the year? Thanks, Brian.
All right, so after we have the Medical Advisory Committee. Since I chaired that last meeting, the full minutes are in here, and I hope you'll take some time to read it. There was actually a lot of great material. Some of the important things that came out on the advice was that they were actually really happy with a lot of the stuff we had set up for getting the PP out and for setting up some of the standards that we have on how some of our interactions were being done and some of the initial screening that would happen for students as they came in. One of the first things that really got up, though, that was really helpful to us was setting up 3 different levels of PPE based on the job specialty of the person and how they were interacting with other people, so that instead of just saying, here's the face mask is the basic requirement, and then if you want more, ask for it. Instead, it became, if you're in this job specialty, this is the minimum of what you have to have. And of course, level 1 was 6-foot distancing with a face covering. But then as we looked at it, it became about, staff working with individuals who can't wear a face covering. They have to go to level 2, which was basically the face covering and the face shield. And basically, these were pretty much the same standards the hospitals are using. So it was really good to get that, add that in as a minimum level so that, you know, people in those specialty areas would be more appropriately protected rather than just a minimum standard. Then we started talking about school procedures around it, and there was a lot of discussion about medical personnel, looking at our protocols, so that again became helpful with a large discussion about symptoms and as to trying to help our staff understand the difference between a common sneeze and a COVID sneeze. And I think that's something they're going to look at even deeper with the idea of can we provide our own staff training so that they'll be able to sense a little bit more and not, I don't want to call it overreaction, but not causing it so that it doesn't disrupt everything when it's maybe not as severe as some people might think, you know, when you haven't been told what the differences are. So we might be able to develop some more of our training on that. We did get into a discussion about closing metrics and a large discussion on really the differences between how you can handle different school buildings, between elementary and middle school and high school, and the fact that you can't segregate the students as strongly on a long-term basis, and that we're going to have to handle that differently. I think, when you see that, I only know of 4 schools that have closed down right now. Only 1 is an elementary school, 3 of them are high schools. And it seems like that's probably going to be more the way it is, because when a high school starts to see cases, you can't stop the spread because the kids are moving between classrooms too much. And yet in an elementary school, you can. By removing a class, you really have removed a large effect, where you can't really do that in a high school. So I think we'll see more on that now that we don't have the Dane County standard to use anymore. There's a large discussion about rapid testing. We've been seeing some stuff about possible screening type tests. It seems like based on the advice that was given, there really is no good screening test for schools. Due to the nature and the expense, there just wasn't anything that's currently out there and available. The saliva tests and all those other ones basically are just not effective enough and trustworthy enough for us to use. There was some discussion about how can we develop a better relationship with possibly Dane County or some of the testing facilities to try to get rapid testing. Because one of the biggest questions that was brought up is if you have a student that you suspect may be positive or may need to be tested, we don't have a way to require them to be tested. It's going to be up to their family to go get them tested. And until that test is done, you basically remove that student from education if they're an in-person student. So the question became how can we help inform the parents that the best thing that can happen is get them to their pediatrician or doctor, get them tested so that if they get a proper negative testing, they can come back to school quicker than just quarantining people on continuous 14-day cycles. Is there a better way to do that? So again, I think that's something that we'll be talking about more as this develops better. And that's kind of a large overview. Is there something I missed?
I think that's it.
I guess one of the things, though, and you get it in the statement, one of the medical professionals said initially they were concerned about going to work in the medical facility, and because of the procedures that were put in place, she feels more safe going to work and going to potentially shopping.
Yeah, their comment, I think, was a grocery store, and if you've been to Woodman's, nobody follows the arrows. So 6-foot distancing is almost impossible there.
But I guess when you look at it, we're doing a lot of, we're not doing it necessarily at the level of a hospital, but we're doing a lot of the things within our buildings, following protocols that I think they thought were very good.
I think that was a strong comment they made, is that they've had very, very few cases among their staff. And each one of those cases has been traced to something outside of work. And I thought that was a strong comment, that if you do mask and you do it right, the way the hospital does it, then yeah, you really do prevent it. But it also makes a very strong comment that the minute you have a team or a classroom or a group or whatever that doesn't, everything falls apart really quickly. It's kind of a double-edged sword. Either do it and be great and keep the schools open, or don't and end up like Janesville or somewhere else.
Yeah, and that's probably our biggest concern. When we have high school age kids, they have jobs, they have cars, they're old enough to go out by themselves. You know, they have sporting events that travel, you know, and that's why we're probably going to see it affect more high school age kids in terms of passing around, because they're out and about, where the other ones might be playing with in their neighborhood, but these kids are traveling a little bit.
So if there's no questions about that, their meeting will be this Wednesday, and Brian will be chairing it this week. Diversity and Equity Committees. Mike?
Yeah, so I mean, the board's already acted on a resolution to just basically say we're in support of what the committee's doing. Our first meeting was effectively, obviously the large committee going around doing introductions and just giving some general ideas. It was, I'd say, useful to kind of just get a feel for the room, because there's a lot of people who I've talked to before, but a lot of people who I haven't. And kind of seeing how all the different personalities are going to mesh together and how to run a relatively large meeting with this many people in a remote fashion. So we kind of talked about just an overall roadmap for what we were going to do. The agenda, I think, just went out for our meeting we have tomorrow, and we're going to be, at my suggestion, having someone hopefully nominate themselves or be nominated as a co-chair, just so there's someone else to run meetings if I'm not there. Discuss kind of how we are going to move into the next stages of what the committee does. Presumably that will be kind of an information gathering area, which I think will probably rely on getting information from Kurt and Tim, as well as potentially some form of a survey or a community meeting, but we'll be hashing that out tomorrow. So I think that's all there is to report.
Mark?
Nice article about the meeting. Looks like a really diverse and talented group of people. Question, I didn't see any identified students or even reference to student members on. Do we have students on the committee?
Yeah, there's 3. I think only 2 were able to attend
Okay,
the first
great.
meeting.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Then we'll move on to administrative reports, beginning with the beginning of the school year.
I think we've touched on much of this. I'm just going to ask Rebecca to pull it back up. You can go to the first slide, next slide there, Rebecca. The question we've had is with regards to enrollment. I'm going to put the big caveat that we're really not going to know the actual final numbers till the third Friday count, which is coming up this Friday. That's when we do our official count. Julie Gengler, our registrar, pulled these numbers together for me at the end of last week. So when we look at it, go back to our budget document, we had a projection of 4,427 students. What we're currently at is 3,347, difference of 80 students based off of projection. I went back then further to our second Friday in January, which was our second count date last winter, and we are down 34 students from there. When you start to look at like a financial impact, if these numbers hold true, remember that the revenue cap is built off a 3-year rolling average. So there's only a third of those that would then be kind of articulated into our average. We'd only lose a third of those students. So potentially, if those stay true, and I'm shooting without the guidance of Steve here, it's about $175,000 impact of that in the first year. Obviously, the one piece we have to be aware of is when you have an impact on enrollment, in order for us to recapture all of them, it takes a 3-year rolling average to also do that. But we'll know final numbers as we come into the third Friday count here at the end of this week. But that's just a high-level piece that Julie was able to kind of pull off for me to kind of give us at least a picture of where we were. When Steve and I were projecting it a number of weeks ago, we were guessing potentially about 100 kids, so it looks like we're relatively close with around 80. But we'll give you a report once the third Friday count numbers are in. All right, next slide. Couple pieces we've also watched enrollment-wise is what's happening with 4K. And you remember that conversation as we were having facility planning numbers. And we had a dip last year of down to like 255 kids. We used that as part of our projection just to be very conservative this year. And 4K has rebounded back to its more normal numbers of 275 as of last week. So that's very positive news. Just to give you an idea of where we're at with the K2 in person versus virtual, these are number of classrooms. We have 48 classrooms that are taking place across the district, K2, in person, and 25 classrooms that are remote. In order for us to pull that off, as Brian has previously reported, we had to hire 2 teachers that were outside of our budget process in order for us to do that. The board gave us latitude to address staffing as we needed to with COVID, and those were 2 that later on in tonight's agenda in the consent, when you hire teachers, you'll see 2 teachers that are moving forward to help us really manage the in-person versus virtual approach. As we expand into other grade levels in the future, if that's under the suggestion and guidance of our medical ad hoc committee, certainly we'll have to kind of also revisit what that may mean from a hiring standpoint.
So, can you project the numbers are almost awash? Is that 48 full-day classrooms, or are they 48 half-day classrooms?
No, that's 48 teachers. That's 48, just think of it as let's just say
So
Mark
that's
Hetzel.
that's
Right.
okay, so
That's
that's
Mark Hetzel's
one full
teaching
class.
morning, afternoon, 48
That's okay.
teachers. Correct.
Thank you.
Yep. So when you look at that, it's not meant to be an AM, PM, it's just that class.
That's okay.
So you can say you have that many
2 to
classrooms,
1.
that many teachers are teaching in those remote places.
Yep.
So you're about a third.
Yeah.
Okay, next item. The first week, I think overall we had a good week as we started off the year. It was great to kind of just get started from an in-person standpoint with our K2. I think that was a success. It was, like I reported to the board previously, it was good to see kids in the school. I appreciate all that our staff and parents have done to help make that successful. Remote instruction, this is based off of observations that I've had, both as administrator being out the schools, a parent being at my home, and also looking at things that I've reports from our staff as far as how things are going. Our staff have done a great job with regards to engaging with our kids. Now granted, that looks differently from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, but they've really put an effort towards trying to be more synchronous as much as they're able to and build in some of the routines of a school day. So those are some pieces that from a planning standpoint was purposeful. I think our parents were asking for that, and we've done the best we can to try to deliver that to the highest degree possible, with also trying to balance that with you don't want a kid just solely parked in front of the screen. I will provide for the board at a future communication if you'd like to see kind of what some of those schedules look like so you can get a better picture of what that is. We've had a few issues at primarily our upper grades with some online behavior. The administration has been addressing that, has been working with parents, and has been working with our IT department. I think that there are some pieces from an IT perspective that we've been able to target in on some things that were, I don't know if vulnerabilities, but some things that we needed to shore up. There were some behaviors that I would say were highly inappropriate, and we've involved appropriate actions, including up to and including police involvement. I don't want to go into too many details on that because some of that is still an ongoing investigation. But there are some pieces that kids, this is a very minority, small group of kids as far as who's doing this. Majority of our kids are doing a phenomenal job with what they're doing and how they're behaving online. But I do need to bring that to your attention because we did have to send out a notification to parents last week, particularly at our high school. This is a piece that I've already shared with you earlier in the meeting, just with regards to our as we expand to in-person. I think we've already really addressed all of those pieces in our earlier dialogue. Are there any questions that anyone has with regards to start of school? I tried to not repeat what I spoke to last Monday as we had our last Tuesday where we had our start of the school year. But I thought enrollment projections are really some of the key pieces that are for us to keep our eyes on.
Just one, how did we sort of select who taught remote and who taught in class, in person?
Yep, I think it started off, first of all, Brian, you're welcome to come up and talk about that. Started off with some of the accommodation requests. And then I'll let Brian talk. He worked very specifically with that.
Yeah, the first thing we communicated to staff was asked who felt they would need accommodation for their own medical condition. And then we went into those that would request a modification because they lived with a vulnerable family member, or they had childcare needs that they wanted to meet for their family. Though initially I was very surprised based on communications I'd gotten from the teaching group. I thought I didn't think we would be able to go into that third level, but that actually didn't fill all the positions that we needed. Then we went out and just opened it up to volunteers to ask if anyone was interested in teaching to a virtual section. Surprisingly, that also did not get everyone that we needed. And then we went to targeted teams and said, we will need a teacher to do this. We would prefer someone to step forward, but if not, we will assign. And those teams then, had an individual step forward to do that.
Any other questions? Thanks, Brian.
So next is we're going to need a resolution for authorizing the temporary borrowing. For those who've been on the board for a while, this happens every year, basically because of tax flow and property taxes. And when we collect at the beginning of the year, we always have to take out this bond in order to cover the big expenses at the beginning of the year, which is higher than we can handle just because we won't collect the taxes until later in the year.
Make a motion to approve.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
It has to be a roll call vote.
Oh, it has to be a roll call vote, sorry. Mark? Jack?
Aye.
Judy?
Aye.
Aye.
Brian?
Aye.
Joan? Mike?
Aye.
Dave? Aye. And that moves us on to consideration of HVAC ionization units for all of the buildings except the elementary schools.
So in your packet, you will find, we did put this out to bid again to NAMI in 1901. We did set a date for receiving those bids and quotations in. Within that time frame, we received one set of quotes from North American Mechanical, which, as you can see, is our recommendation within the proposal. At a later point after our deadline, 1901 did submit costing, but it was, even with that, our recommendation was based on the timelines, and second of all, North American Mechanical was the most competitive of those. So John, you vetted those out and worked through those processes, so anything to add or being able to answer questions from the board?
I agree with that recommendation.
My only question is, on the intermediate school, due to the fact we have the GEO system, I noticed that they're intending to put the ionization system on all the 100+ heat pumps. Since that's a closed loop system, and this is about putting in the amount of ions in the air, would it be worthwhile to only do the main air intakes first? We can then use the ionization tester to see if looping through the GEO system requires us to boost the number of ions coming out of those, or if the levels are going to stay at a reasonable, at the recommended levels, such that we don't have to do the other 102 heat pumps.
My understanding is that if you don't install them in the heat pumps, then the level of ions is reduced. So to your suggestion, I'm not sure, number one, if it can be boosted if we only do it in the air handling units themselves. And from what I understood from the contractors was that putting the units in the heat pumps will provide the right number of ions in order to create the environment that we're looking for with the air. Similar to what we did at the Heritage Elementary School, where we installed the units into each univent.
Right, but
Similar to that.
there you have a problem in Heritage, is that you don't have the airflow through the building steady enough to deal with it. The intermediate school is fairly new. My understanding is that there's been some, talking to some people who've installed it, there's been some facilities where they don't do it in the geo system because they're finding, since that's a closed air system, their ionization level stays good enough with just the base units. I'm just wondering if 102 units against a $130,000 cost for that building, when that's the majority of the install, it seems like we might, if we're not opening the intermediate school until possibly November anyway, this only takes like a 2-week install period. If we do this at the beginning, end of September here, we could check the levels before we sit there and pay the big cost of going to the other 102 heat pumps. But if they're saying that it can't maintain it, and we know that somehow already, I get it. But if it's just,
Yeah, like I said, the information I've received is in order to create the negative ions that are, I'm not going to say required, but that they're after in the building, that would require those installations in the 102 heat pumps. Now, I agree with your thought process that we could test it. Though I do not have the apples to apples comparison on the cost at this time for that lesser of an installation.
I make the recommendation to go with the contract as presented.
is there a second for the motion? Then
Second.
There is a second. Any
I did, it's just curiosity, John, I was surprised that the middle school, which I always thought was our least efficient, was of the 3 buildings, I mean, it's radically, 42,000. Is there just less there, and that's why, or?
What's your question? Because
I was just surprised at the low number for the middle school.
it doesn't have as many air handling units in that building.
Any other discussion?
So we'd be installing all the buildings that are empty now, correct?
Correct.
This would be for intermediate school, middle school, high school, the TLC, which is part of the, and then out here above. So that'd be for the remainder of our facilities.
Was there any mention as to onset time for ordering the material?
I think it would be, I'm not sure 100%, I think it would be similar to the lead time from the existing project that has already concluded.
So it was roughly 2 to 3 weeks, I read?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, do we have any way of getting any data or feedback from anyone to say whether or not it's working or doing anything in 3 buildings that's already been installed? And I mean, I was very much in favor of doing that, but I guess I'm a little more cautious about doing it in buildings that have very few people in them or don't know how many people will be in them for some prolonged period of time. Like, do we have any data that we can point to say, yes, this is in fact a good decision, we've done it in 3 buildings already?
So as far as the ions in the air or from a cost perspective?
Anything that we can use to justify the expenditure of almost $400,000 on HVAC and empty buildings.
I think just the existing research we presented and along with the measurements that we can take from the meters that we have with the project.
Right. And we are hoping to open those buildings up in a few weeks.
And we do have staff in those
Staff.
buildings.
I think, when you look at this isn't just a COVID investment. It's virus, which is flu, mold. So basically you're making the building safer.
It's an enhancement of COVID and post-COVID. And I agree with Joe, and I think the other piece is that we do have staff in those buildings, and I think that's important to support as well.
I'm going to vote in favor of it. I'm just saying we're throwing out a lot of big expenditures before we have a referendum and budget issues that are going to get public eyes on. That's all.
But John, you're saying the measurements are working, right? They're getting what they want in the other buildings we've installed?
That's correct.
Yeah.
The measurements that they've shown to me are, the product is working, yes.
Okay, cool.
I'm going to vote against it only because of that dual level in the intermediate school, because I think we have the time. There's no reason not to do it at a lower level, test it, because we get the testers as part of the install. Run the tests and then decide if you're going to spend another $60,000, $70,000, $80,000. If the levels are good, we don't need to. If the levels are bad, it shouldn't cost anything more to do it afterwards than it did before. It's the same process.
So you're saying maybe don't do it in just the intermediate school?
No, just do the main air handling units in the intermediate school. Hold off doing the closed geo system, because the closed geo system is just pulling air from the building and putting it back into the building. From what I've heard from a couple of installers, there is the concept that you don't always do both. Usually, some places only do one to save money, saying it's a closed air system anyway. You already treated the air once, and then if it comes back out and your ions are running low, then maybe you start adding the geo system. But if they come out decent, now, obviously, every building's different. Who knows? It may be that you're going to have to do it just because there's so many of them. It may be that you don't have to do it because there's not enough of them.
I would submit that if you're going to do this, just go ahead and do it. Because these guys are experts. They've taken care of our facilities. They understand, what our systems are, and I think they've been good partners with the school system in the times that they've been there.
The one thing I recall from the conversations with the contractor was that they're using the mixed outside air handlers in order to feed the heat pumps. So it's not 100% return air or already conditioned air that I'm aware of. I recall them using the mixed outdoor air systems in regards to the heat pumps.
Is there any additional cost for them to do it in steps?
I don't know the answer. I wouldn't think so.
Okay.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. And we move on. You have consideration of an additional position in the Human Resource Office.
As Brian comes forward, I was going to ask Rebecca to pull up the memo that is in the board book tonight. This is for a request for an additional position in the Human Resource Office, funded completely really through reallocation of dollars, no additional expenditures needed. Able to help provide support in the benefits side and also having a second person who can be a specialist in payroll. But Brian, you put together the memo, and if you can just kind of talk through what your needs are and some of the cost pieces so the board can understand what your tables are, that would be helpful.
Thank you. This is actually circling back to a topic that almost a year ago we spoke about as well. Last year, or the first time it came up, the topic focused really on the payroll position. Because at that time, or August, we had a longtime payroll specialist retire. And part of her reason for doing that was the number of hours that the position had, expected. And so we set out to actually interview for a position and a half last year. I would say that we were competing against a different job market. However, we did get down to where we had gotten to 2 individuals. And initially, what occurred is we lost one because of a spouse that lost her job. And so he could not take a decreased role, and for the other person, the role wasn't really specific and identified enough for them to feel comfortable. And so we ended up hiring our current payroll specialist, who has been an outstanding addition to our team. A tireless worker and really just a great teammate. But it hasn't changed the position which we are in. Is we have two positions that every employee cycles through every payroll, and that is our payroll specialist and our benefits specialist. And right now we have one of each, and there's a tremendous amount of institutional knowledge, but there's also a tremendous amount of institutional dependency on those two individuals. And what I'm proposing here came about by never really truly losing sight of that situation. We did, after we got down to hiring our current payroll specialist, really focused on getting her onboarded and continuing her training. But we also still had that need, and the subject really kind of came back when another member of my team approached me with a desire to modify her position. And this was some historical information I didn't have. I didn't realize that one of the members of my team initially was part-time. The department grew, her time, her FTE grew, and she was interested in actually going back to closer to where she started. And so in conversation with Steve, once we found out, I found out about that and a little bit of the flexibility that could provide, this opportunity kind of came to be. And so the top box is really current expenditures or expenditures last year. So the HR administrative assistant is a full-time, 2 is a full-time position. That's the wages, salary of that individual, or hourly wages for that individual. The second box is the overtime of my department last year. To put that number into context, obviously it's essentially almost a whole nother position, and that the vast majority of that overtime falls within payroll and benefits. They both are typically around 60 hours per week. So the last year's expenditures were the $80,174.89 for those two items. What I'm proposing, and this is with the support and interest of my team, is that the HR admin assistant would 2 position would go to half-time. The second line is projected overtime. Part of it, the reason that includes, is $10,000 is currently at this point we've spent $7,169 in overtime already this school year, which, if you would extrapolate it out, takes it out to a little over $43,000. So it's more right now, but it's consistent. And then if I had a second payroll benefits person, the range that they would receive in wages is listed $45,840 to $49,927. The total expenditures then of the half-time position, projected overtime, and this payroll benefits 2 position would be less than what we spent for those last year. Jack?
I guess when we were talking about this last year, one of the things as you were transitioning, you were going from a system that had been in there for a period of time, and you were looking to automate.
Yes.
So you're saying that the automated system, or have you put in an automated system, question 1, and you're saying that automated system isn't as efficient as what was used in the past?
Well, One thing I would say is that what we intended to do, our implementation plan was in the spring, we were going to move employee groups into the True Time, which is the electronic timekeeping system. We lost that opportunity when the employee group that we were going to transition first was our aquatic center employees. We closed the aquatic center, and so we lost the opportunity to move a whole group in. So what we've done instead is we've actually been transitioning to work the system, figure out what we need to do to support supervisors and to train employees. Actually, all of our hourly employees that we've hired since that time have been added to the True Time, the electronic timekeeping system. So we're at about 8% of our employees right now are on it, with the goal of fully transitioning within this next school year. But the second part of your question is that less efficient? Part of the reason that right now our overtime is actually running higher than it was last year at this point. It's absolutely related to COVID and many of the different types of payroll tasks that come with it. The different types of payment for FFCRA is a major one right now, and many of the benefit changes. One of the other parts of saving money through reallocating staff is that involves changing benefits, changing hours, changing schedules, and that again cycles through the benefits office, one person, and that's why we're starting to see those two roles having a higher rate of overtime at this point. Moving forward, my hope and plan is that with an additional person that does both, that we can really chop that overtime off both positions for our financial stability, but also frankly for their personal lives as well. They're completely in support of the idea of not working as much as they are.
This develops a cross-trained model too, which is a piece that we wanted in both the benefits area and in the payroll area. Someone else that if somebody became ill or was gone or could take vacation, that we had someone else who could pick it up.
Yeah. And that's very important.
I move we accept the proposal.
Second.
There's a second by Joan. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? One opposed. Then takes us to seclusion and restraint report, the annual report.
All right, I'm going to ask Kurt to come forward. In your packet, you have the annual seclusion and restraint report, which needs to be brought to the attention and brought to the board. It does not need action. As you will see, that we've had a continued decline in seclusion and restraint. Obviously, last year we also were virtual since the 12th of March, but you can see the data up until that point was still continuing to trend in the direction that we have hoped. So I credit that to Kurt and his staff. Anything, Kurt, you'd like to kind of highlight about the report or any of the requirements that the board has as far as reading it or reviewing it?
Yeah, I really don't have anything to add. I just always give you the longitudinal data, so it's from the year that we had to first begin making these reports to current. There is a new requirement starting this school year where now we have to also report this information to the Department of Public Instruction. I'm just waiting to hear from them as to the exact format for that reporting piece. But if you have any questions.
Any questions? Thank you very much, Kurt.
Great, thanks, Kurt.
That takes us to announcements and correspondence.
One announcement I have is I shared with you an email from Brian Borowski, who was contacted with regards to our high school being named one of the best high schools per U.S. News and World Report. I mean, those are always a piece that it's when there's different metrics that go into these listings, but it's always positive when we get mentioned as part of those lists. So just wanted to bring that to the board's attention.
Number one in Dane County. And that takes us to the consent agenda, where, as always, we can either take one motion to approve the entire consent agenda, or anyone can ask for something to be pulled out to be considered separately. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda? Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Judy. Any questions or comments? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? And that takes us on to board business, of which we have none that I know of. And
One of the things that I'd like to bring up from the policy committee, if you look at our website for board meetings, we require people to give their name, address, and affiliation. But somehow the address was omitted from the policy. And what I'd like to throw that back to the policy committee, because I think it's, even if you have a student that's not, or a parent that doesn't live in the district, they still have an affiliation with the district. I think we're representing, our students, staff, and our taxpayers. So I think.
Are you referencing the policy on public comments? Is that what you're?
That's correct.
yeah.
Okay.
Number 187. If the item in there, we were speaking about this before the board meeting, says each speaker upon being recognized by the presiding officer will state his or her name and identify his/her connection to the district, if any, and to any group they are representing in connection with their remarks. Yet on our website, on the generic page talking about board meetings, saying people can come and speak, it says any speaker will state their name and state their address and any group they may be representing. So we have a little bit of a disconnect between the two. I think Jack was thinking he'd like to see that basically all three parts of information should be there. Address, affiliation to the school, and their name. So that should just go to the policy committee at some point.
I would also include email. If you want us to read the email, that information should be provided in the email.
They should provide that within the email.
So we'll just refer that to the policy committee for their next meeting. Any other board business?
Can I just ask Dave, is there any interest in us making that modification and just bringing it back to the board, or do you want it to run through the committee?
I prefer that I just add the sentence to the policy and send it to Randy and put it on the next agenda, so that's fine.
That's fine with me.
Yep.
Saves a
We
meeting.
can do that. Rebecca and I.
Saves a meeting for me.
Right, sounds good.
Any other board business? Seeing none, that takes us to committee meetings. What do we need?
We do need to set the meeting for next Monday, the 21st, the additional meeting.
Is there a motion to set a meeting for September 21st?
So moved.
Second.
And there's a second by Mark.
6.
Any
6
discussion?
is fine.
It's 6 p.m. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Any committee meetings?
Steve, do you need a committee meeting for budget at all, as we're starting to get towards?
Not until October.
All right, I think we're okay then.
All right. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? And we are adjourned.